Chapter 6. The Festival. Autumn came with a letter. Trey held it in her hands and felt the weight of it, not the paper, which was fine and expensive, but the meaning. My troubles are resolved. I am ready to have them back. Torian's handwriting was neat, his gratitude effusive. He named a final sum that would close the ledger. She would need to set the place and time. Celine and Sully would go home. Trey should have been pleased. A promise kept. Coin earned. The kind of reputation building that made future ransoms easier. Instead, she felt hollow. She sat at her desk in the cabin and stared at the letter until the words blurred. Behind her, Marcus was asleep in the bed, naked, relaxed, one arm flung over his head in the boneless way of someone who felt safe. He'd fallen asleep almost immediately after she'd finished with him, which was usual now. Marcus had learned to take pleasure the way a flower learned sun, instinctively, without question. Trey had trained him to perfection. He knew exactly how she liked to be touched, knew when to be gentle and when to grip hard, knew how to use his mouth, his hands, his body in ways that left her breathless and sated. They avoided the one thing that might get her pregnant. Trey was careful about that, and Marcus followed her lead without complaint. But everything else was permitted, encouraged, enthusiastically explored. Marcus was corrupt to the core now. There was nothing that could be done to a young man that she hadn't done to him, and he had enjoyed all of it. That should have been enough. It wasn't. Somewhere along the way, she'd started to care for him, not just as a warm body in her bed, not just as a pretty thing to order around. She cared whether he was happy, whether he slept well, whether the book he was reading pleased him. She cared, and that made her guilty. Marcus was here because he had no choice. His father hadn't ransomed him. He had nowhere else to go. He stayed because Trey held the key, and no matter how willingly he bent to her touch, it was still a cage. Green had told her weeks ago that the boy would never fit back into his old life. "Look at him," Green had said, watching Marcus laugh at something Sully said. "He's not a lord's son anymore. He's yours." Trey had wanted to believe it. She couldn't. She was too damaged, too twisted, too dangerous. No one could love her as she was. Not truly. Marcus wanted her because she was all he had. That thought poisoned everything. And then there was the other thing. The want that had crept up on her slowly, insidiously, until it lodged in her chest like a splinter. She'd been teaching Sully to navigate one night, pointing out stars, and the girl's face had been so eager, so bright, that something in Trey had twisted painfully. She wanted a child. Not someday. Not in some imagined future where she wasn't a pirate. Now. A child of her own. Someone who would look at her the way Sully looked at the stars. It was a dangerous want. Dangerous because she lived as a man. Dangerous because pregnancy would expose her. Dangerous because a pirate ship was no place for an infant. Dangerous because the only person she could imagine fathering that child was chained to her bed and thought he had no choice. Trey folded the letter and made a decision. She would free Marcus. She would take the ship to Port Easonton under false colors. She had papers for that, forged and expensive, for the times when entering a legitimate port was worth the risk. They would meet Torian during the Harvest Festival when the docks were crowded and no one looked twice at strangers. She would trade Celine and Sully for the final ransom. Then she would take Marcus shopping, buy him new clothes, make him look like a lord's son again. And then she would slip away in the crowd and leave him. Port Easonton was half a day's walk from his father's estate. He could find his way. He would be fine. And she could claim that he had not been freed without ransom paid, merely escaped. Her reputation would suffer, but only a little. Generosity would be a greater sin than carelessness in this business. That was what she told herself. She took care not to think about whether she would be fine afterward. Marcus woke to find Trey already dressed, standing by the desk with something in her hands that day. "Morning," Marcus said, stretching. Trey turned. Her expression was unreadable. "We're going to the port." Marcus blinked. "Port?" "Port Isenton. Harvest Festival. We'll trade Celine and Sully back to her husband today." Marcus sat up, suddenly awake. "Port Isenton?" That was too close. Too close to his father's estate, to people who might recognize him, to the life he'd left behind. Trey crossed to the bed and sat on the edge. Her hand went to the cuff at his wrist, thumb brushing the leather. "We'll go in disguise," Trey said. "False colors, false names. You'll need to look like a merchant's clerk, not a hostage." Marcus's throat tightened. Which means," Trey continued, and her voice was too careful, "you can't wear these." She was holding the bigger key, the one he had seen just once, the one that opened his cuffs. Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Captain." "It's just for a day," Trey said, and unlocked the first cuff. The leather fell away. Marcus's wrist felt naked. Wrong. The absence of weight was worse than the presence had ever been. Trey unlocked the second cuff. Marcus stared at his bare wrists. They'd been part of him for 6 months. He'd forgotten what it felt like to move without the cuff's reminder. "It doesn't feel right," Marcus said quietly. Trey's mouth tightened. "You'll manage." She stood and went to the wardrobe, pulling out clothes that weren't his usual ones. Plainer, cheaper, the kind a clerk might wear. Marcus dressed slowly, aware of how much his hands could move, how light they were. He hated it. Port Isenton. His father's estate was half a day's walk from there, if anyone recognized him. "Stop worrying," Trey said, watching him. Marcus wasn't sure if that was possible, so he tried to hide it, poorly. The singing siren flew false colors and wore a fake name plaque as they approached Port Isenton. A merchant flag and simple name, both common enough to be ignored. The Harvest Festival filled the docks with ships, and the crew slipped into port like they belonged there. Celine and Sully came on deck dressed in the clothes they'd arrived in. Fine, if a little worn. Sully's face was tight, her hands clenched. The dress no longer fit properly. Not just in size, the shape was wrong. The girl in it was no longer a child, nor a simple merchant's daughter. Tommy hovered nearby, red-eyed. "I'll come back," Sully said, fierce. "When I'm old enough, I'll find you." Tommy nodded, not trusting his voice. Sully hugged him hard, then pulled back and walked to Trey, waiting on the dock without looking back. Celine moved through the crew, giving small gifts, carved driftwood, shells strung on cord, things she'd made during the long summer. The women gave her gifts in return. A small knife that fit in a sleeve, a pouch of herbs that would put a man to sleep for a day if brewed in tea, a vial of something Kara said was, for emergencies. Celine held them carefully, eyes bright. "The world out there," Glenn said quietly, "is more dangerous than this ship." Celine nodded. "I know." She went ashore too. Sully took her hand. Trey met Torian in a quiet alley near the docks. The man was tall, well-dressed, and nervous. He looked at Celine and Sully as if he couldn't quite believe they were real. "You kept them safe," Torian said, voice thick. "I gave my word," Trey replied. He handed over the chest. Green took it, checked the weight, nodded once. Torian led his wife and daughter away. Celine's hand was tight in Sully's. Neither looked back. Trey watched them go and wondered what would become of them. They did not belong entirely to the world they were returning to anymore. Then she turned to Marcus. "Come on, we're shopping." Marcus followed Trey through the festival crowd, uncomfortably aware of how exposed he felt without the cuffs. Trey took him to a tailor first. Bought him a coat of deep blue wool, a shirt of fine linen, trousers that fit properly. The tailor didn't ask questions, just measured and cut and sewed with the speed of someone being paid well. When Marcus looked in the mirror, he saw a lord's son again. Tanned, yes. Older, perhaps, but recognizable. It made his skin crawl. Trey paid and led him to a jeweler next. The shop was small but well-stocked, and Trey moved through it with the ease of someone who knew quality. She stopped in front of a display of necklaces and pointed. That one. The jeweler lifted it carefully. A gold chain, delicate but strong, with a small pendant shaped like a ship in full sail. How much? Trey asked. The jeweler named a price that made Marcus's breath catch. Trey paid without haggling. She took the necklace and fastened it around Marcus's neck herself. Her fingers lingered on the little golden ship now resting against his chest. There, Trey said quietly. Her eyes held something Marcus couldn't name. Now you look like you belong somewhere. Marcus's throat was too tight to answer. They walked back into the festival crowd. Marcus stayed close, acutely aware of the press of bodies, the noise, the way Trey's hand occasionally brushed his. Then suddenly, she wasn't there. Marcus turned. The crowd swirled around him. Strangers' faces, laughter, the smell of roasted meat and spiced cider. No Trey. Panic hit him like a fist. She'd left him. She'd brought him here and left him, and he was alone in a crowd, and the ship was… Marcus ran. He didn't think. He just ran, shoving through the crowd, stumbling, the gold pendant bouncing against his chest. Tears blurred his vision. His breath came in ragged gasps. The docks. He had to get to the docks. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't. He burst onto the dock and saw the singing siren still properly moored, black sails furled and nearly sobbed with relief. He stopped at the foot of the plank, panting, tears streaming down his face. Footsteps behind him approached the ship. Marcus turned. Trey stood there, Green beside her with the ransom chest under his arm. Green looked furious. He was speaking in a low, vicious tone, calling Trey every name Marcus had ever heard and a few he hadn't. Then Green saw Marcus and stopped. He laughed, short, sharp, disbelieving. Trey saw Marcus too. She stopped walking and stared at the boy standing at the foot of her ship. He'd run. The moment he'd found himself alone, he'd run. Not toward his father's estate, not toward freedom, toward her ship. He was breathless, tear-streaked, the gold pendant she'd given him catching the light. He looked miserable and terrified, and so beautiful it made her chest ache. She'd set him free, and he'd come straight back. Green's voice was still ringing in her ears, every name for fool, for coward, for someone too damaged to see what was in front of her face. Nobody's asked about him in 6 months. Green had said, voice flat with fury. Not his father, not his brother. Nobody. He's been discarded. And you're going to throw him away too because you're too scared to keep him? Trey had tried to argue. Green had called her a few more names. Now Marcus stood there, and Trey understood what Green had been trying to say. The boy wasn't here because he had no choice. He was here because he'd chosen her the day he kissed her. It wouldn't be theft to keep him. He'd been discarded, forgotten, and he'd run back to her ship the moment she tried to let him go. Trey walked up to him slowly. Marcus's eyes were wide, wet, desperate. I thought… You got lost, Trey said, voice firm. Marcus blinked. You wandered off in the crowd and got lost, Trey repeated. She reached out and cupped his face, thumb brushing away a tear. Foolish boy. Marcus's breath hitched. Trey leaned in and kissed him, gently, not possessive, not claiming, just soft. Come on, Trey said. Let's get a drink. The bar was seedy, disreputable, the kind of place where a pretty boy on a captain's lap brought envy instead of outrage. Marcus sat on Trey's lap, her arm around his waist, and drank watered ale while the captain spoke quietly with Green about nothing important. The weight of Trey's arm felt like an anchor. Marcus leaned into it. A little drunk. They left the bar. Green trailed behind them like a grumpy guard dog, muttering about captains who caused unnecessary drama. They wandered through the festival, holding hands, and somehow, Marcus wasn't sure how, they ended up at the Temple of the North Star. It was a large building, star-shaped with 6 points, an entrance at each and an altar at the center. The last official prayer of the day had just ended. A few priests still milled about, tidying, speaking in low voices. One of them looked familiar. Marcus stared. "Lord Fen?" The old man turned. He wasn't dressed like a lord anymore. He wore the simple robes of a priest, gray and unadorned. He grinned. Brother Finnegan now. Passed on the inheritance. Took vows. The sea spat me out, so the stars took me in. Trey laughed. "You said you'd never sail again to avoid meeting me again, and yet here we are, meeting again." "It is the stars' will then," Brother Finnegan replied. His gaze flicked between Trey and Marcus, taking in the way Marcus stood close, the way Trey's hand rested on his waist and no chains in sight. "Well, I see some things sorted themselves." "Some things," Trey agreed. Brother Finnegan's grin widened. "Want me to marry you?" Marcus froze. Trey blinked. "What?" "You heard me." Brother Finnegan gestured at them. "The way things are, you might as well make it official. North Star doesn't care who marries who. Or why." Trey was tipsy and strangely, dangerously happy. She looked at Marcus. "Would you?" Marcus's heart was pounding. "Would I what?" "Marry me." The question hung in the air. Marcus thought of the ship, the cabin, the cuffs he missed, the way Trey's hands felt on his skin. "Yes," Marcus said. Brother Finnegan laughed. "Good. Come on then." The ceremony was short. They stood at the altar in the center of the star, the old priest between them. Green stood as witness, arms crossed, expression somewhere between exasperated and satisfied. Brother Finnegan didn't ask for vows. He asked for agreements. "Captain Trey Blacksail," he said, voice carrying in the empty temple. "What are you willing to promise this boy?" Trey's hand tightened on Marcus's. "To keep him. Until I die." That was all she could promise. "Marcus Eisen," Brother Finnegan continued, "what do you promise in return?" Marcus met Trey's eyes. "I promise to be kept. Until the day I die." "Then by the stars and the sea and the one God who doesn't care what anyone thinks, you're married." Brother Finnegan produced a certificate from somewhere and scrawled names on it. "Sign here." Trey signed, Marcus signed, Green signed as witness. Brother Finnegan handed the certificate to Marcus. "Hold on to that," he said. His voice dropped, suddenly serious. "As long as you're married, your father has no claim on you." Marcus went cold. The words landed like stones. "Your father has no claim on you." Then Brother Finnegan smiled, patted Marcus's shoulder, and walked away, humming as if what he had said was nothing important. Marcus stared at the certificate in his hands. Brother Finnegan was right. This was how it had always been in his family. An unmarried child belonged to the parents. A married one was an adult in their own right. Green tapped on Trey's shoulder. "Time to go, Captain." They left the temple. The festival was winding down, the crowd thinning. They walked back to the ship in the dark, and Marcus couldn't stop looking at the carefully rolled-up paper in his hands. Married. He was married to a pirate captain, and his father couldn't claim him anymore. Back in the cabin, Trey locked the door and turned to Marcus. He stood in the center of the room, still holding the certificate, still wearing the gold necklace. Trey took the paper gently and set it on the desk. Then she picked up the cuffs. Marcus's breath caught. "Arms," Trey said softly. Marcus held them out. The leather closed around his wrist with a familiar grounding pressure. Marcus exhaled. The chain was no longer needed, but the cuffs were. "You're my husband now," Trey said, voice low and serious. Marcus nodded. Which means you have new duties. Marcus swallowed. What duties? Trey's hand went to her chest binder, began unlacing it. You're going to give me a baby. Marcus stared. Trey finished unlacing and let the binder fall away. Her eyes were dark, serious. I want a child, and you're going to give me one. Marcus's mouth was dry. His heart pounded. Say yes, Trey murmured, stepping closer. Marcus looked at her, this dangerous, scarred, impossible woman who had taken him and kept him and married him. Yes, Marcus whispered. Trey smiled, and Marcus discovered that he took his marital duties very seriously indeed. A baby of his own was more than he had ever dreamed of, and he was absolutely willing to work for it.